This is a special festive episode of Battleboard where we're looking at the Christmas Truce of 1914, a series of impromptu ceasefires that took place during World War I. First, let's catch up on how the war looked at this point. This is northern France, as it was in the summer of 1914. Paris is here, Belgium is up here, and Germany is located over here in the east. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand has sparked war over the other side of Europe, and because of a string of alliances and pacts, Germany is gearing up for a showdown with Russia. But Russia is allied with France, and Germany knows it cannot fight a war in the east and the west simultaneously. So, before the Russians can mobilize themselves, the Germans have planned a rapid and devastating attack on France to knock them out of the war early. This plan, named after the general who devised it, Alfred von Schlieffen, calls for an attack through Belgium, flanking the main French armies on the border and down towards Paris. The Germans hope this offensive will culminate in a decisive battle somewhere near Paris, which will destroy the French army and, as the saying went, end the war by Christmas. This is the story of a bizarre truce that saw snowball fights between enemies, the swapping of gifts, a few games of football, and even some German soldiers trying to carry off a drunk Frenchman. This is the Christmas Truce of 1914, and this is a special festive episode of Battleboard. In summer 1914, the Germans deploy their army ready for the assault. While some troops are sent to the border with France, the vast bulk of its army is sent north towards Belgium. The French, expecting the main attack to come across the border, position their forces here. Meanwhile, the Belgians, thinking they will simply be holding the northern end of the line, position their forces here. In August, the fighting begins. The French start with a series of attacks into Germany to try and stop what they think is the main attack before it can start. These attacks end in defeat, and the French are forced to retreat back across their side of the border. At the same time, Germany launches its main assault in the north. This drags Britain into the war, which is allied to Belgium and sends the British Expeditionary Force to the country to help defend it. But neither of these allies is prepared to face the full might of the German army. The Belgians are swept aside and fall back to Antwerp, whilst the British are pushed back into northern France. This German advance keeps rolling, and by early September, the Germans have reached the outskirts of Paris. But all of that is about to change at the Battle of Marne, here. French General Joffre, having abandoned his original plan, calls up his reinforcements and moves to flank the German assault. Together with the British, they succeed in stopping the advance. The Germans, overextended and exhausted, are forced back to Aisne. The Allies believe the end of the war is in sight and pursue the retreating Germans, thinking they can force them all the way back into Germany. But rather than flee, the Germans bide high ground near the Aisne River and dig in. The very first trenches of the First World War are now being dug. Allied attempts to break through these lines end in failure, so they try to outflank them by moving to the north. This causes the Allies to dig their own trenches. Trench lines require fewer men to defend them than open ground, and this frees up men for the maneuvers. The Germans move to counter, kicking off what became known as the race to the sea. Each side tries to outflank the other, moving northwards, with trench lines stretching out behind them. At the same time, the French armies on the German border are also digging trenches to ensure no new attacks can come through here. By November 1914, without really planning to, both sides have built a trench network stretching from the North Sea at one end all the way to the Swiss border at the other, 400 miles long. Attempts to break through this line, such as at the First Battle of Ypres, end in disaster, with hundreds of thousands of casualties. The problem is that modern weapons like magazine-fed rifles, machine guns and artillery have made attacking very difficult and defending relatively easy. As December rolls around, it becomes obvious to both sides that ending this war before Christmas is now impossible. They're going to be here through winter. And it is in this context that the Christmas Truce takes place. If we zoom in on one section of the front, located here near Fromelles, we can get an idea of how and why this happens. There aren't many actual maps to use from this point in the war, because aerial photography was in its infancy. We based this one on a photo that was taken slightly later, in 1916. At the top, we've got a British trench, and at the bottom, we've got a German trench, with a narrow strip of no man's land between them here. In 1916, these frontline fighting trenches are part of an intricate trench system, only part of which you can see here. There are communication trenches leading away from the front to support trenches and reserve trenches, which include things like command bunkers, their own railways, even telephone lines. But in 1914, they are nowhere near as complicated. This is the first factor that helps explain the truce. Often, there is only the frontline fighting trench, which in places is little more than a hastily dug ditch. Second, in places such as this one, the Allied and enemy trenches are quite close to one another, just a few dozen yards apart. This means that soldiers from opposing sides can easily shout or sing at one another, as they sometimes do, to wind the other side up. British troops, for example, recall being forced to listen to daily renditions of the German national anthem. Third, the trenches are relatively easy to climb out of. What little barbed wire there is has been scrounged from nearby farmland. It's dotted here and there, but it's not continuous along the whole front line. No man's land has not yet become an impassable quagmire of shell holes, mud, and landmines. Fourth, even though hundreds of thousands of men have already been killed at this point, the true horrors of World War I, shell shock, poison gas, and battles like the Somme and Verdun have not yet happened. The opposing sides are not yet so full of hatred for one another that they'll shoot each other on sight. Ad hoc ceasefires are already taking place up and down the line on a regular basis. In letters home, soldiers report holding fire at certain points in the day while both sides eat a meal, or to allow medics out to collect the bodies of the dead for burial. Fifth and finally, big centralized command structures that would come in later in the war to manage these huge armies have not evolved yet. The trench is divided up into sectors, with each sector being commanded more or less separately. Let's say, for the sake of this example, that the section we're looking at here has one commander, but the section to the left and the section to the right have different commanders. Now, bearing all that in mind, let's take a look at what actually happened on that fateful Christmas more than 100 years ago. The truce begins on Christmas Eve, the main day of celebration for Central European Catholics like the Germans, when their troops start singing carols. Some German commanders have allowed Christmas trees to be brought into the trenches, and these are adorned with candles and placed on trench parapets so the British, French, and Belgians can see them. This prompts the Allies to join in, singing their own carols, or, where the troops can speak multiple languages, joining in with the other side. It's important to remember that each sector is different, so this isn't happening up and down the line all at the same time. Let's say in our sector, the commanders have decided to let the men get away with it, and are maybe even fraternizing with the enemy themselves. But it's perfectly possible that, in this sector and this sector, fighting is still going on, close enough for these men to hear the sound of the guns. By the time the sun comes up on Christmas Day itself, the men begin calling out, wishing each other a happy Christmas. In amongst the festive greetings, other messages are shouted. We no shoot, you no shoot. By the middle of the day, with command either turning a blind eye or consenting, the men begin to climb out of their trenches and walk towards one another. Remember, this isn't as odd as it sounds. This was already happening so that the dead could be collected, and perhaps in this section of the trench, it starts the same way. But soon, the men are speaking to one another, exchanging gifts of tobacco or chocolate or wine. These gifts had been included in special boxes sent from home. British soldiers were given a brass tin with an image of Princess Mary on the front and cigarettes or writing materials inside. Of course, Where the British and Germans are involved, football is bound to break out sooner or later. You've probably seen this picture claiming to be from a match on Christmas Day. In fact, it shows only British troops having a game on a completely separate occasion. Though people claimed matches were played on Christmas, there's no firm evidence of this. But we do think impromptu kickabouts took place involving between dozens and hundreds of men. In one case, troops even claimed the Germans tried to carry off a French soldier who got too drunk, forcing his comrades to go and take him back. How do we know all of this? Because the soldiers write home to their families about it, and their families send those letters to the newspapers. We're lucky enough to have been able to get hold of an archived copy of the Daily Mail published more than 100 years ago. This has been sealed in the bag to protect it from outside conditions. Probably no one has opened this bag in 30 years, and probably no one has opened the book itself for 8 decades or more. What we're hoping to find is this front page, December the 31st, 1914. Let's open this Christmas present together. This is the Daily Mail National Edition, November to January 1914. Hopefully, what we're looking for should be somewhere in the middle pages of this book. And we're damn close. December the 30th, 1914. When you can see here the Arc de Triomphe in Paris with wounded British soldiers standing nearby. Again, we're still on December the 30th, so we're going to keep moving through. Here we go. December the 31st. These are men filling sandbags for trenches. This is a photo of a British frontline trench as it was at the time. Sandbags, cooking utensils, entrenching tools over here. What this says is this remarkable photograph, taken under shell fire by a British rifleman, enables one to realize the conditions under which our soldiers live and fight at the front. These men belong to the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade and were standing to at the moment they were photographed, ready to meet an expected offensive movement by the Germans whose trenches were only a short distance away. Unfortunately, not the front page that we expected to find, but I suppose that's what's happening when you work with physical records. But actually, if you look up here on the 4th page of the 1st of January edition, it looks like they were still reporting the truce. You can see up here, 1 day of peace at the front. The following is a remarkable description by an officer at the front of how the British and Germans ceased hostilities at his part of the line on Christmas Day. Christmas will remain engraven on the memory of many British soldiers who were in our trenches here as one of the most extraordinary days of their lives. For on that day, British and Germans ceased fighting with each other for an interval, came out into the open between their respective firing lines, buried their dead, and held a short service in their memory. Here in front of us is some physical evidence, at least, that the kind of truce we were talking about, medics climbing out of trenches, burying the dead, and then fraternizing with the enemy, did in fact take place. And here again, we can see some truth to the rumor of football being played. Football match with a hare. The chaplain jumped up into the open at his heels and, crossing a ditch which runs down the middle of the field between the lines, cried, "Does anyone speak English?" As reply, a private stepped forward, and then to our amazement, we saw our chaplain cross the ditch, salute the German commander and his staff, and begin to talk with them. Almost at the same time, a hare burst into view and ran along between the trenches. All at once, Germans came scurrying from their trenches and British from theirs, and a marvellous thing happened. It was all like a football match. The hare being the football, the grey tunic Germans on one side, and the kilted jocks on the other. So I'm guessing here it's not a literal football match. They're chasing a hare, a rabbit, around in no man's land, each side trying to catch it. Yeah, here we go. The hare being the football. The game was won by the Germans, proving that some things, at least, never change, who captured their prize. But more was secured than a hare. A sudden friendship had been struck up. A truce of God had been called, and for the rest of Christmas Day, not a shot was fired along our section. But over here, if we have a look, just down here, bottom right-hand side, there's some football going on. Within sound of the German guns, many British soldiers enjoyed a game of football. Here is a league match in progress, promoted by the 1st Cavalry Brigade. And over here, a sketch sent to the Daily Mail on a postcard by a Sherwood Forester at the front. It is a rough plan of a football match which took place on Christmas Day close to the trenches. So I don't think these are the British playing against the Germans. I think these are Brits versus Brits. And yeah, if you read here, so it says at the top here, Xmas Day, 25th of December, 1914. This is West Yorks versus East Yorks. The Foresters on the ball, it says. And down here, you can see what looks like the Foresters, which is the regiment that this, or the brigade or unit that this man is from. I think it looks like they're scoring in this. Oh no, actually here it is. Here's the ball up here. Putting it in for a kind of ball into the box, I think. How we spent Xmas, he writes, from A. Forester. So there you have it. At least a bit of evidence of football being played on Christmas Day. Not British versus Germans as we expected, but Brits against Brits. There's one last Christmas gift left, which is this trove of archive photographs. Let's see if there's anything in here. And I mean, straight away, that looks promising. This is a copy, I don't think this is original, but a copy of the Illustrated London News piece in the trenches on Christmas Eve. A German soldier opens the spontaneous truce by approaching the British lines with a small Christmas tree. So you can see there, holding a lantern with a kind of fir tree on top. And I mean, here we go. What we've got here, British and German officers stood together on the front line wearing each other's helmets. More British and German officers stood together. And you can see it here in the annotation of this photo. German officers, Xmas Truce, 1914. That's actually two copies of the same photo, one kind of more pushed in and zoomed in than the other. British and German soldiers arm in arm and exchanging headgear. British and German troops together, fraternizing in no man's land during one of the Christmas truces of 1914. We know that these photos are genuine because relatives of some of these men have come forward since to say, yes, that's my father or my grandfather. He was serving on the front lines in this area during the First World War, and that's him with the German officers. Here is what looks like a center page spread, an obviously photocopied version from the Illustrated London News, January the 9th, 1915. And this looks like an illustrated version probably of these photographs, actually, because you can see the headgear that's been swapped. You can see them swapping cigarettes as they were up here. There's a little Christmas tree adorned with candles has been brought out, as we were talking about before. And it says down here, Saxons and Anglo-Saxons fraternizing on the field of battle at the season of peace and goodwill. Officers and men from the German and British trenches meet and greet one another, a German officer photographing a group of foes and friends. So yes, I think this is a kind of artist imagined version. We can imagine that this guy here was the photographer who took this photo, and these gentlemen lined up here look very like this group or this group of men as it was imagined by an artist after the fact. I think it's safe to conclude from what we've seen here that a Christmas truce did in fact take place almost exactly as we've described. Christmas trees, drink, tobacco being shared, swapping uniforms, coming together to bury the dead and bury the hatchet for one miraculous day in amongst a war that would become so costly and tragic. Sadly, this truce was a one-off. There is some evidence that soldiers tried to repeat it the following Easter, but commanders quickly put a stop to it. After that, there was no question of a truce happening again. The fighting became too bitter, the troops too war-weary, and the trenches and no man's land too hard to navigate. Soldiers physically could not, and morally did not want to fraternize with the enemy. In fact, as the war became much more bitter, soldiers from both sides began to question whether the truce had ever even happened in the first place. In France, Germany, and Belgium, three nations whose homelands were being chewed up in the fighting, reports of the truce were largely hushed up at the time, and after the fighting was over, the truce simply did not fit with the way it was remembered. either as a tragic victory or as a humiliating defeat. In Britain, which was a little more distant from the fighting, reports of the truce were far more common, as we can see, and after the war was done, the country remembered it as one of senseless waste, which stories of the truce helped reinforce. It was held up as evidence that the men hadn't really wanted to fight each other in the first place and were forced to it by an out-of-touch elite. That isn't quite true, of course. We know that the truce didn't happen everywhere, and many soldiers recall fighting continuing the whole way through Christmas 1914. But here, we have hard evidence that at certain times and in certain places, the opposing armies were able to set aside their differences for just a few moments of joy. And these moments became all the more poignant because of the horrors that followed. If you're looking for evidence of a real-life Christmas miracle, then this is surely it. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content and want to see more in your feed, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, or click the buttons on screen to watch other episodes.